So the book's about leadership.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd start there. And my first question then is, if I'd like you to assess the state of global leadership right now. Is it in good nick or not?
Yeah, it's all going great. It's now, look, the book, by the way, I should say, is really, it's a book written based mainly on my mistakes. So, and my theory of leadership in government is that leadership of a country or a company or a community center or coaching a football team, it's more or less the same type of attributes that make for successful leaders. And look, people always say about every time that the leaders aren't as good as they used to be or whatever. So I don't, I'm not going to pass judgment on the global leaders as a whole. I do think what is important, because we're living in a very unpredictable world, right? The geopolitics is much less predictable because you've got big power confrontation in a way that you wouldn't have had when I became prime minister over 25 years ago. And you've got this technology revolution that we're going to talk about, but these things are changing the world very fast. And therefore, I think the most important thing for leaders, and I say this to the leaders I work with in different countries, it's the most important thing when the world's really unpredictable is do all the things you should have been doing anyway, but just do more of them and further and faster. And I think that's the only way to survive right now in a world where you really can't be sure what's going to happen either economically or geopolitically.
So what tell us about, you said the book's about the mistakes you made. Tell us about a mistake you made that you think a lot of leaders today still make.
Well, on the domestic side, I was um, I was too slow to realize that the system as a system was not going to deliver the change that I wanted. And therefore, in my second term, I changed the center of government completely to get a much greater focus on the priorities of government. And frankly, to bring in people from the outside who I felt could offer more and better ideas. And the one thing I think, whatever you're doing in leadership that is absolutely essential is you've got to have clarity of direction. People need to know that they're going to a destination. You need to better spell that out for them. And I can't remember who it was who said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. But it's you do need to know where you're going, because that is the way you also galvanize the people behind you to operate according to a plan. And the leader's got to have a plan.
So talking about knowing where you're going, something that wasn't really an issue when you were in power was, and I know there's, the term is used very loosely, but populism wasn't really a thing. It is now. Do you think populists can be good leaders too?
Yeah, I think they can be. But I think you've got to understand, but first of all, you've got to define what populism is, because, you know, it's not populist to want to be popular. In fact, for a leader in a democracy, it's quite a good thing to aim for. Um, I define a populist as someone who um, rides the anger rather than providing the answer. But I think populists on the whole exploit grievances, but they don't invent them. So if you look at how people are, for example, exploiting the grievance of immigration, yes, they do exploit it, but yes, it is a real issue. And I think the problem is, I always used to say to people that the center of politics, because I'm not a tribal politician. I'm not driven by a conventional 20th century ideology in terms of market versus state and so on. I used to say the center's got to be the place of radical change. It can't be the place of managing the status quo. I think that was true when I was in office, but I think it's even more true today, that people, when I was in power, people wanted the system improved, and today they want it changed fundamentally.
But I mean, the backdrop is so difficult now. You've got a very demanding electorate. You've got very little money. You've got these geopolitical sort of uncertainties, technological change. Sometimes I think, is it even possible for a democratically elected leader to be a leader, or is it just a question of making, confronted by a lot of very poor, bad choices, making the least bad choices?
It's a great question. It's one I think about a lot, because the challenge of democracy is efficacy, and it's getting things done. And anyone who's ever been in government knows the toughest thing is to get anything done. Um, And the problem is that, when you visit countries that aren't democracies, but they've got strong leadership with a clear direction, they're taking long-term structural decisions. And those long-term structural decisions are worth taking, but they take time, right? That's why they're long-term. However, having said all of that, I still think, in a democracy, people want leadership, and they will mobilize behind leaders. And right now, today, what I think people want, and I say this constantly to the people I work with, whether in the developed world or the developing world, and my institute's in almost 50 countries now, um, they've got to think you're going to move things. Now, obviously, you're going to move things in the right direction, but a lot of it's just a frustration that the politicians seem completely paralyzed and unable to take those types of long-term decisions and really push them through. And that's why I think the skill set you need today in government. I mean, I came to this conclusion, and part of the reason I wrote the book was I came to the conclusion in the end that, you come to power as the great persuader, but actually when you're in power, you've got to be the great executive. And I came to the conclusion, I mean, I'm talking to a room full of chief executives, that actually the chief executive skill set was more applicable to government. You still need to persuade people, but it was more applicable to the business of government than the politician's skill set. And I think that's why if I was back in government today, I would change completely the way government operates and works, because one, because I think this technology revolution is a revolution. And secondly, because you need people, politics is the only profession in the world in which you put someone in a really important position, handling billions of pounds or dollars worth of money, with no qualifications. No, it's an incredible thing. I mean, right? You never, if you were running, I don't know what football team people support here, but let's say Manchester United. If you're running Manchester United, you say, okay, we've got the next coach, and we're just going to go and get the most enthusiastic fan. Right, that's what we're going to do. They're going to be the coach. I mean, the fans themselves were going, no, that's a bad idea. You're going to get someone who's really qualified. So part of the problem is in democratic politics, and this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I say to leaders, there are principles of governance. And often when I sit there with a new leader we're working with, I'll say to them, I can tell you what you should do, because, by the way, we now have almost a century of experience of governing right around the world. And believe it or not, there are principles that you can derive from that, in the same way that there are principles from football coaching you can, or from being a chief executive that you can. So I can tell you what to do. The thing you're going to find really hard is how you do it. But so I think today the problem is these issues, they're not really ideological questions. How you reform your healthcare system it requires deep understanding, really hard work, and that kind of executive mindset.
So how do you advise leaders then about what happens when they meet resistance? Because look at how messy the UK is. It's a democracy. Maybe a bit of benign autocracy would help set up some of these long-term plans, but that's not something that's currently on the horizon. So how do you affect change? I mean, the UK is hard enough, never mind Europe, which has got 27, 26 competing sets of rules and administrations. How do you affect change when you're also battling against, the backdrop is a messy, noisy democracy?
Yeah, and that is the challenge with it, because when you decide, you divide in government. That's
Mm.
what happens. And also people's expectations run far, far ahead of anything that anyone can ever do. I mean, I remember on the night I got elected in 1997, and I mean, everyone was sort of euphoric around me, and I think I was the only person who hadn't had a drink that night. I mean, convinced teetotalers, and I was just focusing on the magnitude of the task. And I remember someone all wandering up to me and saying, "Ah, Tony, now everything is possible." And I was like what? I mean, what do you mean everything's possible? What, you just think because we're elected, everything? I mean, so people's expectations are really high. And so here's what I learned. First of all, you've got to put policy first and politics second if you want to govern effectively. And a lot of the problems that we get into is where people put politics first and policy second. And what I mean by that is you work out what you think is the right answer, and then you try and work out how you persuade people that it's the right answer. But if you go to the politics first, you find you're always chasing. You're chasing whatever is the prevailing wind of public opinion on any one issue or on any one thing. And then you just end up with incoherence. But policy, if you put it first and seek the right answer, that is a deep business. And, that's why I say to people, at one level, politics is, kissing babies, shaking hands, glad handing slogans, campaigns, all the rest of it. And that is quite brutal and quite superficial. But at another level, politics, when it's about policy, it's deep. It's an intellectual thing. You've got to go really deep. And that's why I think what I say to leaders today is understanding this technology revolution, understanding it and working out its implications, how you master it and harness it. That is your task, but you're going to have to study it because it's not easy. But it is fundamental to whether you succeed or fail, because if you do want to make change, the great benefit today of being in government is you have within your hands the instrument of change, which is I think the technology revolution.
And how do politicians go about? I mean, key to the success here is also messaging, and at the moment there seems to be a real premium on authenticity. So, the government here, if they've got reform snapping at their heels, reform have got what sounds like an authentic message that some would say that this government isn't countering it in an authentic way. I mean, where does messaging or narrative come into all of this?
Well, I think, you see, I was actually having this discussion with a group of MPs this morning around this authenticity question. And I was saying to them, the authenticity comes from saying what you believe, right? So, and I think saying what you believe is much easier to do if you actually believe it. So the first thing is to work out what you do believe. So I was having a conversation with a politician the other day, and we were talking about the politics, and I said to them, yeah, well, what do you actually think is the right answer? And they were sort of like, yeah, I hadn't really thought of that one. And then we had an interesting discussion about this very point. That, the question is, what is the right answer? So, by the way, when I'm talking about the technology revolution, I'm saying that is the thing I would focus on. Right? I may be wrong, but let's have a debate about it. Because if I'm right, it's what you should be doing. And if I'm wrong, then you shouldn't be doing it at all. But you can't, as it were, it's not one of these things where you can sort of just play around with the politics of it and think you've got the right answer. So this is what you learn over time in government, and where, as I will say to people, the irony of being in democratic politics is that you start at your most popular and least capable, and you end your least popular and most capable. I mean, that's why after 10 years, I wanted to say to people, look, you really, I know how to do this job now. Just let me get on with it. But no, this isn't not the way it works, really.
Who would you, in I think a fairly small category, who would you point to today as being a successful leader? Is there someone you can hold up as somebody who's doing the job well?
You know what I've learned, Emma, is that if you do that, you make one friend, and everyone else is, what? Me? I'm sure he meant me. No. So I don't think I'll answer that one.
Well, okay, then you're not going to answer my next question either, which is, can you give us an assessment of Donald Trump's leadership style?
Way off bounds.
Oh.
No, I'll give you an assessment of why, because I do think that is important for conventional politicians, on the assumption we can agree that he's not conventional. It's, if you don't deal with the problems, then then someone will come along and say, I've got to change the system radically. And that's why this is happening all over. It's happening all over the Western world. I mean, if you take most, you see, in America and in the UK, our political systems, the way they work, they favor the two traditional parties, right? But even with our system, favoring the two traditional parties. You can see it's getting disrupted now, as you say, by reform. But also, remember at the last election, you had 5, 6 parties almost with either double-digit or almost double-digit support. So you had MPs getting elected first past the post with under 40% of the vote, quite regularly. There actually are a handful that were elected with under 30% of the vote, right? So, but the UK and US, two main parties, are favored by our electoral system. You look around the rest of Europe, even in Germany, where you've got the CDU and the SPD, their vote is historically way below what it was before. If you take the French election in 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy won the French election as a conservative, following Jacques Chirac as a conservative. 2012, you had Francois Hollande from the Socialist Party. I don't think anyone thinks it's very likely that the next French president will come from either of those parties. And the combined vote in the last election, which President Macron won, was, I don't know what it was, but small. I mean, maybe even barely double digits, actually, but small.
Yeah.
So I think, and, just look across the whole of Europe today, all of that. So the Trump phenomenon in America is you can echo that right across the Western world. And it's a sign that people really want change, and they really want politicians that do think out of the box. That's, and if you're, that's why I've said to people here and elsewhere today, it's disrupt or be disrupted. Probably true in business, but possibly true in politics.
Okay, so that brings us then to technology. You talk a lot about how governments could harness the potential, harness technology to do exciting things. What do you think is this? What do you think it is? What's the biggest missed opportunity by governments when it comes to using technology?
Well, I think you can just take a step back and think. The first question is, how big is this technology revolution? And I just think we're living through the equivalent of the 19th century Industrial Revolution. So if you ask the question, how much did the 19th century Industrial Revolution change the world? Change it completely. It changed government. It actually gave birth eventually to the political parties we have, one representing capital, one representing labor. The 20th century phenomenon was really all about that. It gave birth to the type of state and government we have today. So I think when you think about the technology revolution, we have a project inside my institute called the Reimagine State. And I just think everything should change, right? So I think you will run public services completely differently, or should. So, I think you could switch the health care system to prevention today if you really set about it imaginatively. You can do education completely differently. You solve many of the problems of law and order. If you want to do it. Now, there's going to be a big debate, by the way, around privacy and all of these things. I'm not saying they're not controversial. Digital ID, for example, obviously right. How governments use technology to get their data all in a place where you can analyze it together. I mean, all the things I guess companies are doing now, and then just inside government, think of all the tasks you can do where you can use AI to do them much more effectively.
So again, can you give us an example of a country that's even coming close to harnessing this sort of potential?
Yeah, the countries, I mean, and this is what's interesting, the countries that you would pick out as doing particularly well on this at the moment, I guess Singapore, it's a big surprise, not. Actually, the UAE, which is really moving ahead on this at a huge speed. You've got a little country of Estonia in Europe, which is probably as good as any on the technology side. And then you've got things happening in individual countries that are going well. But you look, even just take one thing where we did use technology in this country, right? On passports, okay, which was a complete nightmare for a time and then got turned around by the use of technology. Or you take our, UK Biobank, and the use of technology for medical research has had a huge impact on our life sciences. I just think you're just in a new world completely, and I think it's very hard for leaders to kind of understand just how deep this goes. But just to give you an example of something I did myself, because we in the institute, we take a large language model, we put our own data into it, and we can kind of with reasonable security, sort of cordon that off, as it were, and we use that internally. But I was doing something actually to do with the work that I was doing in the Middle East, where I wanted to compare a proposition that we were putting forward today with the propositions that have been put forward in the last 20, 25 years, you know, with hordes of different bits of information and so on and so forth. And how did the proposition that we wanted to put forward, what were the differences between all the things that have been suggested in the past? So that would be a complicated piece of research to do. Our system that we're using, ChatGPT, gave it to us in about 40 seconds now, because I know the area very well. Obviously, it's a co-worker, right? It's not a substitute. You've got to look at it, but it was very good. So I just think, if you think about, you know, I was talking to one of the ministers today about the civil justice system and the length of time it takes to get courts hearings for small claims. You know, all of that could be changed. You know, you can use facial recognition to deal with a lot of the criminal, the criminal elements. You can probably disrupt a lot of organized crime if you want to do it. I think it's not like there's 3 or 4 things you can do. It's, my view is, when you get your head around it, you realize it is literally a revolution if you deploy it properly. And I think it will also be massively disruptive. I think when you get artificial general intelligence, that's going to be its own revolution on top of the revolution you've already got. And then I think, you know, I was speaking a lot to people, group of people on robotics the other day, and getting myself brought up to date with the developments there. I think that's going to be massive. So, I just think you're in a new world, and the question in government is, are you going to be, you know, how slow are you going to be? Because I always say to people, if you know, Clement Attlee, who was the Labour Prime Minister after the war, if Clem came back to the UK today, I mean, he would be walking around London and dazed. He'd be dazed by all the technology, the way the place looked, how different it was, the different makeup of the community. And then he'd go back into Whitehall and he'd feel completely at home. You know, you'd say, I know, you say, yeah, okay.
I was hoping you were going to say it's all happening, but anyway.
No.
But so we're in a brave new world, but sadly the old world continues to cause a lot of problems. Now, so I want to turn to some geopolitics now. Now, when I was growing up, people used to say you could never solve the problem of Northern Ireland. The problem in Northern Ireland did get solved, and you were obviously a critical part of what happened there. You also are an expert on the Middle East. The things are looking very bleak there at the moment. Do you think that the Middle East is like Northern Ireland, that there can eventually be some sort of peaceful solution?
I mean, I do, but I honestly can't tell you at this stage whether that's based on a reasonable objective assessment or an innate optimistic nature. Uh, but I think the best way to look at the Middle East is just take a step back, and all over the region, the same issue is happening, which is whether countries can become religiously tolerant societies and connected economies. And you've got forces that want to turn religion into an ideology, which is destructive and extreme. And you've got endemic problems of corruption and old practices which hold back economic enterprise. And I think the most exciting thing about the Middle East is what's happening in some of the countries where people are modernizing and modernizing fast. And, you know, there's, you know, for example, a social revolution going on in Saudi Arabia at the moment, which is economically and politically really important. So I think, and, you know, with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it's, yes, you can envisage a solution to it, but it's only going to be if you find a way in which you can both offer the Palestinians hope and the Israelis security. I think it's possible to do it, but right now it's obviously pretty bleak.
Did you support the government's move a couple of days ago to sanction the 2 Israeli cabinet ministers?
Well, I try not to give a running commentary on what the government's doing, and also because I'm involved now in talking to different people about it. But I think the most important thing is just to realize that ultimately these are not the issues that are going to decide whether we have it's the way to bring this to an end is to make a clear decision as to who governs Gaza afterwards.
Mhm. The other big sort of geopolitical story obviously is China. And there's a huge tension between, although I gather that the trade talks have reached some sort of resolution between China and the US. But how do you think the West has got a coherent strategy towards China? And also, where does the UK fit into that, and the EU for that matter, while the US and
Well,
China's
I mean,
still
I
firm?
have a particular view as to how to handle China, but I acknowledge it's a very difficult issue, and people can have different perspectives, which are, reasonable. Um, I mean, I hope America and China do come to an agreement. I don't think it's possible or desirable to try and isolate China from the world. China deserves to be a world power by dint of its population, its civilization, its technology, its economy. Um, and we need China to solve the problems as part of solving the problems of the world. So I'm not in favor of isolating China. I do understand the risks that China will pose in certain respects, especially to our countries, to the Western world, and that's why when I'm asked to describe my views to the right policy towards China, I say we should be strong enough to deal with whatever comes out of China, but we should remain engaged with it. And so I think if we're able to, I favor keeping cultural ties between China and the West. I think it's important. I personally like it when you've got Chinese students coming here. I would like to see more British and Western students go there. I think there's a, I don't think isolating China is possible, and I think it's a big mistake to see China in the same way that we saw the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, first of all, was an essentially imperial enterprise. Um, uh, and secondly, the amount of trade the Soviet Union did with the West at the end of the Soviet Union was minimal.
Mm.
The amount of trade that China does with the world, even what it does with America, is vast. So you've got a whole set of intersections there. I think some of the Chinese technology is really interesting and can benefit the world. So I agree that there's, we're going to be competing for sure, occasionally confronting for sure, but we should reserve some space for collaboration also.
Okay, so we are running out of time, and I wanted to allow for some audience questions, but I also still have some questions, so I'm going to quickly crack on. The one thing I want to go back on leadership is this issue of trust, which is something that we certainly in the media think about a lot, and everyone, when every fact is being contested out there in the sort of digital media space, how do leaders go about fostering trust with their electorates? And there's so much cynicism now, and it gets
Mm.
inflamed by social media. What is trust? How do you build trust as a leader?
Yeah, you see, I think it's very difficult this because often people will say they trust a leader when when the leader's telling them what they want to hear.
Mm,
And I will say that's the time you should trust a politician least. Because unless they're an idiot, they know what you want to hear.
mm,
So if they're telling you something different from what you want to hear, probably is because they actually think it.
yeah,
And it's just so I think respect is a more
mm,
tangible thing to seek because I am amazed at when people. I mean, if a chancellor's spending a lot of money, I mean, I just remember think of this with Rishi Sunak when remember he was chancellor during COVID, he's spending all this money. People trusted him a lot when he said, "We can't carry on spending this money. We got to cut the expenditure." I didn't trust him at all.
mm.
But I mean, so I think honestly, I think this is you've got to be very. There's trust at a superficial level, at a deep level. I think people trust you if they think you believe in what you're doing.
Good. Okay, so are there any questions from the audience? There's one here.
Hey, hi.
Bal Das from BGD Holdings. I'd be interested in your views, Prime Minister, on the importance around the question Emma, you posed on trust, the importance of our alliances in coming together to address the issues on geopolitics that you suggest cannot be done on a bifurcated confrontation or cooperation. Those alliances, how do we strengthen them? Are they strengthening? It seems to me that we are fracturing those alliances, which would allow the Western leadership to be able to deal with the issue that you point out, which has no easy answer. Would be interested in your reflections on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, I think, you see, there's nothing wrong with alliances being readjusted. So, for example, when President Trump says to Europe, we should spend more on defense, we should spend more on defense. When he says it should be a more equal partnership with you guys taking more of the burden, I mean, he's not wrong about that. But the alliance itself, I think, is really important. So I think in the end, you need alliances in order to, where there is a false dichotomy put before people often is when people say, well, an alliance is the sacrifice of your self-interest in the communal interest. But actually, it's usually an enlightened form of self-interest, right? You're able to advance your own position better by being in alliance with others. And I think this will be particularly important in a world where, well, I think by the middle of this century, you'll have essentially America and China will definitely be the superpowers, probably with India, right? That's how I look at it, because I think India's population, it's got much more confidence today. I think you're likely to have those three, but I think those three are going to be so much bigger than number 4 that the rest of the world's going to have to form alliances if it wants to sit at the same table as the giants. And that's why I think, when people, not to go back into the Brexit thing, but when people, when people thought, well, Britain will be the first and then all these other countries will fall like dominoes. No, because there's this, I think, centripetal. Is it centripetal that pushes the thing together? Yeah. This centripetal force is none of the individual countries of Europe are big enough to sit at that table with the giants unless they're sitting together. And I think you'll find, in Asia, Southeast Asia, they'll band together as they are doing in ASEAN. I think the Africa Union even will get its act together, and Latin America. And people, look, they've got a long way to go, these regional alliances. But I think that is where things are going to go, because people will realize otherwise we're just not strong enough. And that's why I think it's important to see an alliance as part of your self-interest rather than the sacrifice of your self-interest in some sort of greater good. It's really, the reasons why it's important for these East European countries to be part of NATO is because they know if they don't stick together, then they're going to hang separately.
Okay, I am under pressure to wrap this up, but I am going to do some quick fire questions first. 1-word answers only, otherwise we'll get chased off the stage. Okay, this is the first one. It's a bit hard to answer with one word. But anyway, the decision you think about most today?
The decision I think about?
The one you took in government.
Well, probably all the post 9/11 stuff, yeah.
Yes. What's more dangerous right now, populism or apathy?
Apathy.
The first word that comes to mind when you hear AI?
Change.
Your proudest achievement outside of office?
Family. Family.
Family. And since I was interviewing the CEO of Netflix, I'm going to ask you what I asked him. What was the last thing that you binge watched?
Oh my God, what a last binge watch. On Netflix, it's got to be on.
It doesn't have to be on Netflix.
It's an embarrassingly long list, actually. What's the last thing? I can tell you, Bosch, the detective series I'm watching. That's quite good. I quite like that.
I've never heard of it.
You never heard of it? You see, but that's because you live such an elevated life as editor of the Wall Street Journal. Yeah.
Well, as punishment, your final quick-fire question. Will there be a reform government in the UK?
I think not.